Chapter 6 is all about the Revolutionary War, about the fighting and the buildup, and how to convince people that you are on the right side. Right? The American Revolution was not a sure thing. The people who wanted revolution, the people who wanted independence, they were not the majority. Most people, they couldn't decide which one they wanted to be. There were some who were for it, there were some who were against it, and there were some who were just like, well, I'm not sure. And, the story of how it succeeded, it's a story about convincing the people who weren't sure that this was the right thing to do. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. As we talked about before, the first battle of the American Revolution was Lexington Concord, and there was about a few colonial Minutemen militia, which is just regular people who've decided they're going to fight, versus trained British soldiers. And the British soldiers, there was 700 of them that went to go and find the ammunition and supplies over in Concord, and at first there were only 26 colonial militiamen who opposed them. They were warned by Paul Revere, and who won that battle? Well, the British won pretty easily, right? They lined up against each other, and it was the shot heard around the world, and most people believe that the British shot first and kind of wiped them out. Then they marched to Concord, and the American militia kept shooting at them and wouldn't fight fair. And remember I talked about that. So they never got to Concord, and they retreated all the way back to Boston. So it was considered a victory for the Americans. So this is the first fighting of the American Revolution, and now it's on. Right? So what does it take to start a revolution against the British? Remember, the British were the most powerful empire in the world. They had the world's strongest navy. They had a pretty good army, and they were well supplied. They were a very rich country. It's going to take a lot to defeat them. And the American colonies, there are 13 of them. They're not super poor, but they have no navy. They have no experience fighting. What's it going to take to fight against the British? So the big question is, what do we do now? The fighting has started, and we're kind of in it, right? Do we give up? Well, no. So the Second Continental Congress, every colony sent representatives. They met in Philadelphia, May 10th, 1775. They took 3 actions. They made 3 decisions, which kind of seems to contradict each other. But when you think about it, it doesn't really, right? The first action was they decided to create what's called the Olive Branch Petition. They write out a list of all the problems they had with King George, and send it to him and tell him, here's the problems we're having, and if you can fix it, we can compromise, and we don't have to have a war, right? But if you don't, then we're kind of already started the war. Second action they took was that they decided we're going to make an army. Right? We're going to take all these. We're going to call for volunteers. We're going to get an army together and train them. Right? And since the war started in New England, it's going to be a New England army. Right? But some of the other colonies are saying, well, no, that's not really good at all either. We need to create a continental army, one that represents everybody. And the third decision was probably the smartest one they did, was to pick George Washington as the commander of the army. Now, George Washington probably did have the most experience. Remember, he was fought in the French and Indian War. Of course, he lost that battle, but he was kind of a very a handsome guy. He was a very brave guy. He had lots of experience. Everybody liked him, and he could command. Everybody could see that he was a good leader. And even though he didn't have the best record as a soldier, as a general, and in fact, for the rest of the war, he actually lost the majority of the battles that he fought. he actually did prove to be a very good general and one of the best presidents we've ever had. But we'll talk more about that later. Take a look at this painting. This is a picture of Boston in June of 1775. In the foreground, which means in the front, you can see, a battle going on. The guys in blue are the American colonists. The guys in red are the British redcoats. And, what problems do you see for the American colonies? Right in the center is Boston, right? That's got the town, but it's surrounded by British ships. Right, the British ships, they got the red, white, and blue flag with the crosses, and they're kind of surrounded, right? And all the British had to do was cut off Boston, and Boston would be kind of isolated. So that's what they're kind of fighting. So this is one of the weaknesses that the American colonists had. So how could they possibly beat, such a powerful navy and such a powerful army? The next battle that takes place is the Battle of Bunker Hill. The American commander was William Prescott, and the British commander was William Howe, also called Lord Howe. And the Americans were outnumbered. There were 1,200 of them, and there were 2,400 British soldiers. The British, of course, were better trained and better equipped, and they were there. But the Americans were there to fight for freedom. And so it takes place in Actually, it takes place in Breed's Hill, which is, Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. They're pretty close to each other. But the point of it, it's on a hill. And the Americans got to the top of the hill first, and they kind of fortified it. That means they put up a little wall, and they put up they could hide behind, and they had cannons, and so they were ready for the British. And the British had to march up the hill. Now, the Americans knew they didn't have enough ammunition. So the American commander, Prescott, told all his soldiers, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. Now, in order to see the whites of somebody's eyes, they have to be super, super close. And so not shooting until they're that close, that's pretty, you got to be pretty brave to do that, right? Now, the British, of course, they're trained, and they're, like I talked before, they're trained to march up the hill in nice rows, right? They're not trained to, it takes a lot of bravery to walk up a hill, or just to line up and to march even though people are shooting at you. And the British soldiers were certainly very brave. But the point is, when you're walking up a hill, it's actually hard, right? It's kind of hard, and by the time they got up to the top of the hill, they're tired, and all of a sudden the Americans start shooting at them, and it just kind of like wiped out the first wave of British soldiers. So they died, and they retreated, and they attacked again because they were really brave. And then they were wiped out again, and it took 3 times. And then the Americans, they ran out of ammunition, and they had to surrender. But it was the British won, but the Americans proved they could stand up to the British. That they are not just going to be, even though the British are better soldiers and more prepared, the Americans could fight just as well. And if they hadn't run out of ammunition, who knows what would have happened. Well, after all this, George Washington arrives. And he comes in on his white horse and his nice blue uniform. And he finds 16,000 volunteer colonials there who have volunteered to form the Continental Army. Now, Washington, remember, he's not from New England. He's from Virginia. And so he actually kind of represents, this is going to be a Continental Army. It's not just going to be the people from New England who are fighting. And he knows how to get them trained. So he starts to train them. He starts to get them, because in order to fight a professional army, you have to have a professional army. You have no hope of defeating them if they really, really put their mind to it. Right? So Washington begins training the Continental Army. General Howe, the British commander, he leaves for Halifax, Canada, and King George orders a blockade of all the ports. He orders that Boston Harbor be closed. He orders that the Americans not be allowed to trade with anybody. And so the British Navy shows up to start chasing the ships around to keep them from buying and selling, which would, would make them bankrupt and so they would have to give up the revolution.
You say the price of my love's not a price that you're willing to pay. You cry in your tea, which you hurl in the sea when you see me go by. Why so sad? Remember we made an arrangement when you went away. Now you're making me mad. Remember, despite our estrangement, I'm your man. You'll be back, soon you'll see. You'll remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You'll remember that I served you well. Oceans rise, empires fall. We have seen each other through it all. And when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. Da 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 da. Subject, 'cause you're my favorite subject, my sweet submissive subject, my loyal royal subject, forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. You'll be back like before. I will fight the fight and win the war, for your love, for your praise, and I'll love you till my dying days. When you're gone, I'll go mad, so don't throw away this thing we had. 'Cause when push comes to shove, I will kill your friends and family to remind you of my love. Da 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 da. Everybody. Da 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 da. Da 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 da.
If you'd like to see more Hamilton videos, please share this one. Oh, and don't forget to ring the bell. We'll be back. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Toys.
As you can see, King George's response to the olive branch petition was, yeah, right. So it was on. The war was on. There was no turning back. And, well, Thomas Paine wrote a pamphlet called Common Sense. 500,000 copies sold in 6 months. In it, he argued that the American colonies need to become independent. You know, we don't owe any loyalty to King George. You know, he's your king, but you know he's not trying to help you. He's only in it for himself. He's a tyrant. He's abusing, taking away your rights. He's abusing our, people. You know, he's sending soldiers to fight us. You know, what loyalty we owe him? So this is how we're trying to convince the people who are not sure what side should we pick. So the fateful step. Well, now there's no turning back. Right. So June 1776, the Continental Congress decides, yes, we have to declare independence. We have to go forward. So, knowing that they would be declared traitors, which was, going against your own country, if you were caught, they picked a committee, right? The committee to write up the Declaration: John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman. However, Thomas Jefferson, like I said, did most of the writing. In fact, came up with the whole first draft by himself and put it together. They talked about it for a month. They voted on July 2nd. 12 of the colonies accepted it. New York wasn't quite so sure. They argued and they accepted it. They voted again on July 4th, and it was approved. Right? The most important date in American history, and the Declaration of Independence was approved. And so that's how we celebrate as the birth date of our country. Now, I know I already went over the parts of the Declaration, but here's a couple more ideas I'm going to go over again because, well, they're that important, right? List some unalienable rights, means the rights that people have that can't be taken away, right? Consent of the governed. Consent of the governed means that the people who are part of a country, they pick and they consent to the government, right? That the government only exists because the people allow it to, and because the people need the government to protect their rights, and if the government stops doing that, well, then what good is the government, right? So why do we have it? The next section lists all the British problems, right? The problems the Americans had, and King George had not, everything he had done was out of line. So the question is, where would your loyalty lie? If you were one of the colonists living in that time, there were three choices. Do you want to support independence? Do you want to support the king? Or do you kind of want to stay out of it, right? Estimates are, traditional historians have kind of thought, maybe only about a third of the people living there were for independence, were hardcore independence. About a third were loyal to the king. They wanted to stay part of the British, and there were these people called loyalists. They're also called Tories. Kind of means the same thing, and it's estimate as low as 20%, as high as 1/3. So, which leaves about a third of the people of the colonies kind of undecided. Which side to pick, and the important thing is, who are they going to side with, right? And it split families up. In fact, Benjamin Franklin and his own son. Franklin was a patriot. His son was a loyalist. And it also kind of depended on where you're at. The people who believed in independence the most were in the North. They supported that. The people who believed in staying loyal to the king, well, there was a large number of them in the southern colonies, and so where you were at kind of influenced a lot about what you believed, right? So this particular picture is a picture of tarring and feathering. They picked somebody. The Patriots picked somebody who was loyal to the king, and tarred and feathered him. That means they dipped him in tar, which is kind of like a black glue kind of thing, and then dunked him in goose feathers, and so he looked really ridiculous. And people, this was war, and neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and it was pretty bad.